Cop tries to remove black woman from court. Then a call from the White House shifts everything. "Ma'am, you need to leave now." The officer's sharp command cut through the tense courtroom. Teresa Marshall stood her ground, gripping her legal documents as murmurs rippled through the crowd. "I have the right to be here," she stated firmly, refusing to budge. The judge's gavel struck down with finality. "Not anymore. Bailiff, remove her," Judge Hessington ordered. Sergeant Kyle Harrington stepped forward, ready to escort her out. But before he could place a hand on her, the courtroom doors swung open. A breathless clerk rushed in, clutching a folded note. "Your Honor," the clerk's voice wavered, "there's a call for you from the White House." A stunned silence fell over the room. The judge hesitated. The officer froze. And in that moment, Teresa knew everything was about to shift. The courthouse in Shady Grove, Maryland, buzzed with restless energy that Tuesday morning. People lined the polished marble floors, each waiting their turn before a judge known for her steely demeanor and swift rulings. The black metal detectors beeped incessantly, scanning each person's bags and bodies for even the smallest contraband. From the outside, the courthouse exuded authority. Grand columns, massive wooden doors, and an American flag swaying gently in the breeze. Inside, however, it was a pressure cooker of fear, tension, and desperation. Young lawyers in rumpled suits rushed past, clutching files and briefcases to their chests. Families huddled in corners, whispering prayers for leniency. Court staff typed furiously, updating records, answering phones, and directing the chaotic human flow. Signs urged silence, a nearly impossible request in a space filled with whispered debates over bail, fines, charges, and pleas. Even the air smelled of anxiety, a mix of old paper, stale coffee, and nervous perspiration. Amid the hurried confusion, one figure stood out: Teresa Marshall. A tall black woman in her early 40s, she wore a simple black blazer over a crisp white blouse, her neatly braided hair pulled back. Her expression was resolute, though weariness lingered in her eyes. Teresa commanded attention without needing to raise her voice. She had fought countless battles in her life, from a difficult upbringing to professional struggles, but today felt heavier than anything before. She was here to testify in her own workplace discrimination case against a prestigious marketing firm that had fired her under blatantly biased circumstances. After months of legal wrangling, her day in court had finally arrived. She clutched her documents, feeling hope and dread intertwine. She had prepared meticulously with her attorney, determined to stand her ground. But she had no idea how drastically this day would unfold. Tucked in the corner of the same hallway stood Sergeant Kyle Harrington. Tall and muscular, with a chiseled jawline and close-cropped hair, he exuded an air of authority. Though he was no stranger to courthouse duty, something in his stance signaled tension. Teresa had noticed his watchful eyes following her from the moment she stepped inside. Her hearing was scheduled for 9:30 a.m. in room 306, a courtroom notorious for Judge Marjorie Hessington's rigid, no-nonsense approach. Teresa slipped into the wooden benches as her attorney, Rick Stanton, an idealistic, middle-aged man with a reputation for taking on civil rights cases, offered her a reassuring nod. On the opposite side, the marketing firm's legal team radiated quiet confidence. Their lead counsel, a man with slicked-back hair and an expensive suit, smirked slightly, as if he already knew the outcome. Before the session began, Teresa once again caught sight of Sergeant Harrington. He had entered the courtroom, scanning the audience until his eyes landed on her. It was routine for officers to be present, but his gaze carried an edge, something unsettling. Judge Hessington, clad in black robes and wielding an intimidating stare, emerged from her chambers. The gavel struck. Formalities were exchanged. Teresa's heart pounded in her chest. She had been waiting for this day, to present her evidence, to tell her story. Her attorney wasted no time, displaying glowing performance reviews and stellar client testimonials. Then, he introduced damning internal emails, messages revealing that after a new manager took over, Teresa had been repeatedly passed over for promotions in favor of less qualified white colleagues. There were even allegations of racist remarks made behind closed doors. But the opposing counsel smirked, poking holes in every argument, painting Teresa as nothing more than a disgruntled employee looking for a payout. Judge Hessington's expression remained unreadable. Her eyes flicked between Teresa, the attorneys, and the evidence, but her demeanor held an undercurrent of impatience. As the minutes dragged on, an uneasy feeling settled in Teresa's chest. She wasn't just fighting for her case. She was fighting against a system that had already made up its mind about her. An uphill battle, then came the unexpected confrontation. As Teresa finished responding to the opposing counsel's cross-examination, she requested permission to address the court once more, citing newly discovered evidence. The judge, already exasperated by the length of the hearing, rolled her eyes and snapped, "That's enough, Miss Marshall. You've had your chance." Teresa attempted to clarify, insisting that the defense had failed to disclose crucial emails. But Judge Hessington's patience wore thin. "I said enough," she raised her voice. "If you speak out of turn again, I will have you removed from my courtroom." Something in that exchange, Teresa's refusal to be silenced, ignited a spark. Sergeant Harrington, standing near the door, immediately stepped forward, as if waiting for an excuse to intervene. Judge Hessington's frustration finally boiled over. She pointed a firm finger at Teresa. "Since you refuse to follow instructions, Miss Marshall, I am ordering you to leave." Her gavel struck sharply, the sound reverberating through the courtroom. A collective gasp rippled through the spectators. Rick Stanton shot to his feet, hands raised in an attempt to de-escalate the situation. He explained that Teresa was under immense stress, that the new evidence could be a game-changer, and that no disrespect was intended toward the court. His words fell on deaf ears. "Bailiff, remove Miss Marshall from my courtroom." "Now," Judge Hessington declared, using the formal title for courthouse security. Sergeant Harrington took it as his cue. Advancing toward Teresa, his expression made it clear he was more than ready to comply. Teresa's world seemed to shift. This was her chance, her moment to expose the injustice she had endured. If she was removed now, her testimony could be disregarded, her evidence buried. Desperation surged through her. She opened her mouth to protest, but Harrington loomed over her, his handcuffs clinking at his belt. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "you need to leave now." Rick placed a steadying hand on her shoulder and whispered, "Let it go. We'll figure this out. Don't make it worse." Hot frustration burned behind Teresa's eyes, but she forced herself to remain composed. She gathered her files, evidence she had painstakingly prepared, now seemingly rendered useless. The courtroom watched in silence. Some faces held pity, others smug satisfaction. Harrington gripped her upper arm, guiding her toward the aisle. A flush of anger spread through her. Why was it always so easy for those in power to silence black voices? She held her head high. She had endured adversity before, but this felt like a betrayal of the justice system itself. With quiet but unshaken dignity, Teresa walked toward the double doors. The entire ordeal had lasted mere minutes, yet it carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of humiliation. Just before she stepped outside, Harrington's grip tightened slightly, a subtle reminder of control. She bristled but bit back her reaction. Staying calm was her only option if she wanted any hope of salvaging her case. She could feel the stares piercing her back. Little did she know, the real battle had only just begun. The moment she crossed the threshold, time slowed. Harrington pulled out a small notepad, jotting notes between occasional glances at her. Teresa resented the way he scrutinized her, documenting her every movement, as if searching for evidence where none existed. She folded her hands in her lap, forcing herself to remain composed. Outside the courthouse windows, the day carried on. The sun shone brighter, traffic rumbled past, pedestrians hurried to work, to brunch, to meetings. Life continued uninterrupted. Meanwhile, Teresa's world had come to a grinding halt. After what felt like an eternity, Harrington tucked his notepad back into his vest. Straightening his stance, he looked ready to escort her out. But then, to Teresa's surprise, he spoke. His tone was lower now, not quite apologetic, but less rigid than before. "Look, lady, you put me in a tough spot," he muttered. "The judge told me to remove you. I was just following orders." Teresa studied him carefully. She knew that excuse. It was just another version of "I'm only doing my job," a phrase marginalized people had heard for generations. She swallowed the urge to lash out, knowing that her anger could be twisted against her. Instead, she kept her voice steady. "I understand you have a job to do, Sergeant," she said, "but it also matters how you do it." For a brief second, something flickered across his face, something almost human. Then, as if remembering his role, his expression hardened once more. "If you've got a problem, take it up with the judge," he said flatly. "I don't make the rules." He turned to walk away. Before he could take another step, Teresa gathered her courage. "One day," she said quietly, "you might find yourself on the receiving end of injustice. When that happens, remember how you treated people when you had the power." Harrington hesitated. Then, without a word, he continued walking. Teresa watched him go, feeling an odd mix of anger, pity, and determination. Maybe he was just another cog in the system, but even cogs could decide how roughly they turned. She stood, clutching her documents and her dignity. The corridor suddenly felt empty. Rick Stanton had yet to appear. Teresa clung to a fragile hope, however slim, that the judge might reconsider. Teresa checked her phone, but there were no new messages. Little did she know, chaos was erupting inside the courtroom. The judge and opposing counsel were debating whether to hold her in contempt. Rick was fiercely objecting, waving the newly uncovered evidence that Teresa had attempted to present. The argument intensified, tensions mounting toward a breaking point. And then, in the midst of the turmoil, something completely unexpected happened. A call from Washington, D.C. was about to disrupt everyone's sense of normalcy. Back in courtroom 306, disorder reigned. Rick Stanton stood at the plaintiff's table, his face flushed with frustration. He pointed to the fresh emails, documents that, he argued, undeniably proved Teresa had been singled out by her employer because of her race. Judge Hessington, scowling, warned him, "Counselor, if you don't control yourself, you'll be held in contempt next." The opposing counsel seized the opportunity, dismissing the new documents as either irrelevant or unauthenticated. Confusion spread through the room as the bailiff struggled to restore order. Then, the tension was abruptly interrupted. One of the court clerks rushed inside, heading straight for the bench. She leaned down and whispered urgently in Judge Hessington's ear. The judge's irritated expression shifted to one of surprise. She turned sharply to the clerk, who handed her a folded note. Hesitation flickered across her face, then her brow furrowed deeply. Clearing her throat, she pounded the gavel. "We are going into recess," she declared. "All parties remain in the vicinity. This court is adjourned for a 15-minute recess." A wave of confusion swept through the room. Lawyers exchanged bewildered glances. Rick, determined to keep fighting for Teresa, stepped forward, but the judge raised a hand to stop him. "Counselor, I said we are in recess," she repeated firmly. With that, Judge Hessington stood, gathering her robe, and briskly exited toward her chambers, the clerk hurrying after her. No one in the courtroom had any idea what had just happened, or why the judge had so suddenly halted the proceedings. Even the opposing counsel, who had only moments ago worn a look of smug confidence, now seemed equally puzzled. It wasn't until the clerk quietly slipped into the hallway and spotted Sergeant Harrington that the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. For Harrington, the day had been routine, tense, but not unusual. The abrupt recess, however, piqued his curiosity. "Sergeant," the clerk said, "the judge needs you in her chambers immediately." Harrington's eyebrows lifted slightly. It was uncommon for the judge to summon a court officer outside of disciplinary matters. Without hesitation, he turned and followed the clerk. Inside the judge's chambers, the atmosphere was tense. The dark wooden furniture and shelves lined with thick legal volumes gave the space an air of solemnity. Judge Hessington sat rigidly at her desk, speaking on the phone. "Yes, Mr. Secretary," she said, her tone uncharacteristically deferential. "I understand. Yes, I'll see to it immediately." She glanced at Harrington as he stepped inside, then quickly averted her gaze. Her expression was grave. A few more clipped nods and quiet "yes, Sir S," and then she carefully placed the receiver down, as though it carried a weight far heavier than its size. "That was the White House," Hessington said, meeting Harrington's gaze. Her voice was quiet, but firm. "Teresa Marshall's case has come to the administration's attention. Someone very high up wants to ensure that her testimony is not silenced." A jolt of disbelief ran through Harrington. The White House? He had heard about the administration's recent efforts to crack down on discriminatory practices, but he never imagined it would reach a single courthouse in Shady Grove. "This changes things," the judge continued, her voice carrying an unusual note of uncertainty. "I need you to locate Miss Marshall immediately and bring her back to the courtroom. If she's been restrained, remove the cuffs. Do whatever is necessary. We are resuming the hearing as soon as possible, and she is to be given every courtesy." Harrington blinked. He thought back to Teresa, her quiet dignity, the frustration simmering behind her eyes, the way he had gripped her arm only minutes earlier, ushering her out. Now he was being ordered to escort her back, not out. The irony did not escape him. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, uncertain of what else to say. Judge Hessington grabbed a thick case file from her desk, flipping through the pages. "Sergeant," she said sharply, "I don't know what you overheard, but keep this confidential." The call was from the Secretary of the Department of Justice. "The administration has taken an interest in Miss Marshall's case. They made it very clear that there will be consequences if her right to a fair hearing is compromised." Harrington swallowed hard. This was far beyond any standard procedure he had ever encountered. "I'll bring her back, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady. Turning on his heel, he left the chambers, his mind racing. The sheer whiplash of the situation was dizzying. One moment, he had been removing Teresa from the courtroom under the threat of contempt, and now he was under direct orders from the highest levels of government to ensure she was treated fairly. The wheels of power were turning in ways no one had foreseen. Harrington moved swiftly through the corridor, scanning the crowd. The courthouse hummed with its usual rhythm, lawyers murmuring in corners, families anxiously waiting for news. Then, near the exit sign, he spotted her. Teresa was leaning against the wall, silent. Tears slid down her face. Tears streaked down her cheeks as she stiffened, noticing Harrington approaching. Her expression was guarded, likely bracing for more hostility. Before Teresa could speak, Harrington raised a hand, an almost conciliatory gesture. "Miss Marshall," he began, his voice noticeably softer than before. "You're requested back in the courtroom." Teresa blinked in disbelief, clutching her documents closer. "By whom?" she asked. She had no illusions about Judge Hessington's earlier fury. "By the judge," Harrington replied, glancing around as if wary of eavesdroppers. "There's been new information." She studied him carefully, searching for signs of a trick or bureaucratic maneuver. "Why the sudden change?" "I can't say," he admitted, though he carefully avoided mentioning the White House's involvement. "But the hearing is resuming, and the judge specifically wants you back." Teresa glanced toward the elevator, then down at her phone. Still no messages. She wondered if Rick had managed to turn the situation around or if some unseen force had intervened. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Sometimes, justice comes from places you least expect." Noting the subtle shift in Harrington's demeanor, she decided to trust her instincts. With a curt nod, she responded, "Fine, let's go." Side by side, they moved down the corridor. Though they walked together, the power dynamic between them had irreversibly changed. Onlookers who had seen Harrington escort Teresa out minutes earlier now watched in bewilderment. A few murmured, recognizing her name from the earlier announcements or from local news coverage of her discrimination case. Word was already spreading, something significant had happened. As they re-entered the courtroom, The atmosphere was thick with tension. Lawyers, clerks, and the small audience immediately turned their attention toward Teresa and Harrington. Judge Hessington was already seated, shuffling through papers with an air of forced composure. Rick Stanton stood at the plaintiff's table, his expression a mix of relief and curiosity. The opposing counsel, who had previously exuded confidence, now appeared unsettled, blindsided by the abrupt turn of events. Judge Hessington cleared her throat. "Miss Marshall, please take your seat," she said, gesturing toward the plaintiff's table. Gone was the sharp, dismissive tone from earlier. In its place was a strained civility. "Mr. Stanton, you may proceed with introducing any new evidence relevant to the case." Rick opened his mouth, momentarily stunned by the judge's sudden shift in demeanor. He quickly recovered, motioning for Teresa to sit beside him. Her heart pounded as she stepped forward, conscious of every eye fixed on her. The stark contrast between this moment and her humiliating removal minutes ago was overwhelming. Once seated, Rick leaned over and whispered, "What the heck just happened?" "I have no idea," Teresa murmured back, "but let's make the most of it." The judge looked at them expectantly. "Counsel, you may continue." And so began the second act of a hearing now under the scrutiny of forces far beyond the courtroom walls. For the first time, the possibility of real justice flickered within reach. With renewed determination, Rick introduced the newly discovered emails into evidence. As the overhead screens lit up, the contents left little room for doubt. The messages were laced with racially coded language, subtle yet damning. Management had openly questioned whether Teresa was a fit for our clients, referring to her urban style as a concern. Another email chain exposed how her bonuses had been quietly reduced without explanation, while less qualified colleagues enjoyed steady promotions. The revelations sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Even Judge Hessington, previously indifferent, now appeared visibly troubled by the blatant bias on display. The opposing counsel scrambled to object, claiming the emails were irrelevant or lacked authentication. But Rick remained composed. He meticulously laid out the digital trail, verifying timestamps, recipients, and metadata. His argument was airtight. Tension soared as the courtroom absorbed the stark reality of Teresa's ordeal. For the first time in a long while, she felt something unfamiliar. People in positions of power were actually listening. Taking a steadying breath, she found her voice. "This isn't just about me," she began, her tone trembling slightly but gaining strength with every word. "It's about every employee who has been overlooked, underpaid, or dismissed, simply because of their race. These emails prove what I've been saying all along," Teresa stated firmly. "They reveal a clear pattern of discrimination, and if no one stands up against it, that pattern will only continue." A heavy silence settled over the room. Even the opposing counsel, who had exuded confidence earlier, now leaned back in his chair, his smug demeanor fading. It was clear he understood. These emails were not just an inconvenience. They were a bombshell, carrying the potential for serious legal consequences that could extend far beyond Teresa's individual case. For the next hour, Rick carefully laid out the full context of each email, methodically connecting the dots. He also introduced testimonies from two of Teresa's former colleagues, who had quietly submitted affidavits describing eerily similar experiences. Though they feared retaliation, their statements reinforced Teresa's claims, painting a picture of a company culture that systematically sidelined Black employees. As the evidence unfolded, Teresa was overwhelmed by a surge of emotions: vindication, anger, relief, exhaustion. She had spent months preparing for this moment, yet she had never imagined it would take such a dramatic turn. Her gaze briefly drifted toward Sergeant Harrington, who remained near the back of the courtroom. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. He looked different now, less rigid, as if he had come to understand the weight of the injustice he had inadvertently participated in earlier. Judge Hessington remained composed, but her continuous note-taking and solemn nods made it clear that she was taking this evidence far more seriously than before. Once the last email had been presented, she sat in brief contemplation before turning to the defense counsel. "Do you have any rebuttal at this time?" The defense attorney rose to his feet, his usual confidence noticeably shaken. We request a short recess to review these materials, Your Honor, he said, his voice betraying a slight tremor. Judge Hessington's gaze moved from the defense table to Teresa. Very well. 30 minutes. We will reconvene promptly. There is much to discuss. With a measured strike of the gavel, she announced the recess. A collective exhale rippled through the room. Teresa slumped into her chair, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Rick reached over and gave her hand a reassuring pat. We've got them on the ropes, he murmured. Hang in there. As the attorneys began gathering their documents, Teresa's phone buzzed softly. She glanced down at the screen. A message from a friend. Turn on the news. Your case is making headlines. Something about a call from the White House. Her eyes widened. She felt as though she had stepped into an alternate reality. Just that morning, she had been an ordinary citizen fighting for justice. Now, she was at the center of a national storm, both uncertain and hopeful about what lay ahead. During the recess, the courthouse halls buzzed with speculation. News of the White House's involvement had spread like wildfire, though the details remained murky. Some whispered that Judge Hessington herself was under scrutiny, facing potential investigation if she didn't allow Teresa a fair hearing. Others claimed a high-ranking official had personally intervened to ensure the proceedings remained unbiased. The most outrageous rumors suggested the president himself had made a call, instructing the judge to do the right thing. Though no one could confirm the specifics, one thing was certain. Teresa's case was no longer just local news. Near the vending machines, Teresa and Rick found a quiet corner to regroup. They needed a moment to breathe. Rick checked his phone, texting a few journalist contacts to verify the story. The responses came quickly. This is a game changer, he murmured, scanning the messages. They're saying this case could set a precedent for federal anti-discrimination enforcement. Teresa's heart pounded. I never wanted to be in the spotlight like this, she admitted. Rick gave her an understanding smile. Sometimes the spotlight finds you, he said gently. And if we play our cards right, you could help change a broken system. She lowered her gaze, thinking of Ava at home. Already, social media was ablaze with commentary. Teresa worried about her daughter reading hateful remarks or invasive personal attacks. But if this was the cost of exposing injustice, she was willing to see it through. A voice from behind startled them both. Excuse me. They turned to see Sergeant Harrington standing a few feet away, his posture less rigid than before. His hands hung loosely at his sides. Teresa eyed him cautiously. Yes, he cleared his throat. I wanted to say something. Rick subtly shifted, ready to step in if needed. Harrington raised a hand, almost placating. I just wanted to apologize, he said. I was doing my job, but I realize now how it must have felt. Being removed from the courtroom like that. It wasn't right. And I'm sorry. Teresa studied his face, searching for any sign of insincerity. She saw none. There was no malice in his expression, just an uncomfortable mix of regret and self-awareness. I accept your apology, she said quietly. But that doesn't erase what happened. Harrington gave a short nod. I know, he admitted. I just wanted you to hear it. He turned as if to leave but hesitated, glancing back over his shoulder. For what it's worth, he added, I didn't think they'd actually listen to you, but it looks like you've got some powerful people on your side. Teresa didn't respond. She simply watched him walk away. As Harrington retreated down the corridor, a sense of emotional turmoil followed in his wake. Rick placed a reassuring hand on Teresa's shoulder. I told you people can change or at the very least admit when they're wrong. Let's just stay focused on the hearing. Okay? She nodded. The countdown to the next session had begun. They had only minutes to refine their arguments, but the sudden wave of publicity and high-profile support felt like a turning tide. For the first time in months, Teresa sensed the real possibility of victory. The remainder of the proceedings felt almost anticlimactic in comparison. The defense scrambled to salvage their position, insisting that the emails were not representative of the company's culture and that their general policies promoted inclusivity. But the damage was already done. Judge Hessington scheduled a separate hearing to determine damages and potential injunctive relief. Meanwhile, a liaison from the Department of Justice formally requested that all case records be submitted for potential federal review. When the gavel finally came down, declaring the session adjourned, Teresa leaned back in her seat, both physically and emotionally drained. Rick, beaming, wrapped an arm around her in a brief, congratulatory hug. "We did it," he whispered, though they both knew the legal battle was far from over. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones extended. The case had exploded into public consciousness, in no small part due to the rumored White House intervention. Unaccustomed to the glare of media attention, Teresa tried to remain composed. Rick guided her through the throng, offering statements about how this was a victory for civil rights and a wake-up call for corporations that continued to engage in discriminatory practices. Teresa answered a few questions, her voice steady despite the whirlwind around her. "I just want justice," she said, her words echoing across the cameras. "Not just for myself, but for anyone facing discrimination. I hope this encourages more people to speak up." Her statement rippled through local news channels and quickly made its way to national broadcasts. Across social media, people began sharing their own experiences with workplace bias, voicing both their support for Teresa and their outrage at her former employer. Behind the scenes, the marketing firm scrambled to contain the fallout. They released a statement asserting that they did not tolerate discrimination and that they would be conducting an internal investigation. But the damage was already taking its toll. Consumer confidence wavered, their stock price began to plummet, and whispers of class action lawsuits started circulating. By mid-afternoon, Teresa found herself ushered into a quiet conference room. Rick shut the door behind them, offering a rare moment of respite. "You okay?" he asked. She let out a shaky laugh. "I'm not sure. Today has been surreal." Rick grinned, eyes gleaming with pride. "Did we really just have a DOJ observer show up? And a phone call from the White House forced the judge to let me speak?" "Yes, we did." His smile widened. "Congratulations. You just made history. Here in this courthouse and maybe beyond." Teresa sank into a chair, exhaustion washing over her. She rubbed her temples, thinking of Ava, thinking of the months of stress and struggle that had led to this moment. A mix of gratitude and lingering disbelief settled in her chest. And then, a realization struck her. Even when the system seemed rigged, even when those in power appeared immovable, sometimes the smallest spark, a leaked email, a timely phone call, could shift the balance. For the first time in a long time, hope burned bright. She was not alone in this fight, and neither were the countless others who had suffered in silence. Later that evening, after the courthouse had emptied, Sergeant Kyle Harrington walked the now quiet halls, securing the building for the night. His colleagues had gone home, and the usual hum of daytime activity had faded into silence. The overhead lights flickered faintly, casting long shadows and revealing the age of the building, an institution that had seen countless battles for justice play out within its walls. As he passed courtroom 306, he paused, staring at the empty space where, just hours earlier, an extraordinary shift had taken place. He had never witnessed such a dramatic reversal before. More unsettlingly, he had never felt so personally implicated in one. Something inside him had shifted. Perhaps it was the raw conviction in Teresa's voice. Or maybe it was the undeniable power of the White House stepping in. Slowly, he pulled out his small notebook, flipping through the pages filled with his notes from the day. Security checks, timestamps, incident reports. His eyes lingered on the entry documenting Teresa's removal. The more he thought about it, the heavier the guilt settled in his chest. He recalled the way she had looked at him when he grabbed her arm. She hadn't been resisting. She had simply been desperate to be heard. A wave of unease washed over him. He had always prided himself on upholding the law, on maintaining order. But today, he had been complicit in silencing a black woman who was fighting for her rights. Slipping the notebook back into his pocket, Harrington continued toward the exit. As he passed by the judge's chambers, he noticed the door was still shut. Through the frosted glass, the faint glow of a desk lamp was visible. Maybe Judge Hessington was still inside, grappling with the weight of the day's events, just as he was. Pushing open the heavy courthouse doors, Harrington stepped out into the cool evening air. He inhaled deeply, staring at the sky, where streaks of orange and purple painted the horizon. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly introspective. A sudden vibration from his phone jolted Harrington out of his reverie. It was a text from his wife. "Are you okay? The news is everywhere about that courthouse case. Something about White House involvement." He typed back a brief reply. "I'm okay. Busy day. Let's talk when I get home." Slipping his phone back into his pocket, he headed toward his car, his mind heavy with contemplation. Maybe an apology to Teresa was just the beginning of what he owed her. Perhaps there was more he could do in his position to ensure such injustices didn't happen under his watch. Change often started with a single step, a moment of self-awareness. As he drove home, Harrington couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed a threshold. Ignorance was no longer an excuse, nor was neutrality an option. Whether he liked it or not, he had become part of something bigger, a story that demanded moral courage. In Washington, D.C., the corridors of power buzzed with their own brand of tension. White House Press Secretary Linda King stepped into the daily briefing room, where reporters were already poised to pounce on the morning's biggest topics. The air conditioning struggled against the heat of the television lights, and the murmur of expectant voices died down as she approached the podium. "Good morning," she began, scanning the crowd. "I'll take your questions now." Hands shot up. She pointed to a reporter from the Associated Press. "Is it true that someone in the White House directly intervened in a Maryland court case involving alleged racial discrimination?" the reporter asked, referring to Teresa Marshall's lawsuit. Linda kept her expression neutral. "The administration, including the Department of Justice, is deeply committed to protecting civil rights across the nation. While I cannot comment on specific phone calls or communications, I can say that the federal government has the authority to investigate potential civil rights violations, even at the local level." A chorus of follow-up questions erupted. A CNN reporter pressed further. "So are you confirming or denying that the White House directly contacted a judge about Teresa Marshall's case?" Linda paused, carefully choosing her response. "What I can say is that the administration is aware of Ms. Marshall's case, and we take any credible allegations of discrimination very seriously. The Department of Justice has a mandate to ensure compliance with federal anti-discrimination laws." That wasn't exactly a denial. The room buzzed with speculation. Linda smoothly pivoted to another topic, but the seed had been planted. There had, indeed, been some level of high-ranking involvement. Later, as she walked through a quieter hallway away from the press, a staffer whispered to her, "We're getting hammered on that Teresa Marshall question." Linda nodded curtly. She knew that admitting to direct judicial influence could be controversial, but ignoring blatant discrimination was not an option, especially for an administration that had built its platform on social justice. Somewhere behind the scenes, someone in the Civil Rights Division had recognized the significance of Teresa's case. Perhaps they had ties to an advocacy group that had forwarded the new evidence. In an administration particularly attuned to racial justice issues, it wasn't far-fetched for someone to pick up the phone and ensure due process wasn't being denied. As Linda returned to her office, she exhaled slowly. The public would debate whether White House involvement was appropriate, but in her mind, allowing discrimination to go unchallenged was never an option. Sometimes the right moral choice came with political risks, and that was a trade-off the administration seemed willing to accept. In a sleek boardroom overlooking downtown Baltimore, executives from the marketing firm at the center of Teresa's lawsuit gathered for an emergency meeting. The polished mahogany table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but the atmosphere in the room was anything but polished. The CEO, a silver-haired man with weary eyes, scrolled through an endless stream of negative headlines on his tablet. "This has gotten completely out of control," he muttered, his voice carrying through the tense silence. "Our stock dropped another 3 points this morning." A marketing VP cleared her throat. We've prepared a media statement emphasizing our commitment to diversity and inclusion. We're also launching an internal investigation. A scoff came from the company's legal counsel, seated at the far end of the table. That might not be enough, he said, adjusting his glasses. This case has the potential to trigger a class action lawsuit. And with the Department of Justice watching, we're exposed on all sides. The CEO frowned, rubbing his temples. What about an out-of-court settlement? Can we make this go away quietly? The legal counsel shrugged. Possibly, but she seems determined to see this through, especially with all the media attention. We'd have to offer a significant settlement, a formal apology, and demonstrate actual changes in our corporate structure. Another executive spoke up. And let's not forget, employees are already speaking out on social media. Some are saying they've faced the same kind of discrimination. This might not be an isolated case. Tension thickened in the room. For years, the company had operated with subtle biases, passing over certain employees for promotions, attributing failures to them more readily than to their white colleagues. It was a system so ingrained that senior leadership had never questioned it. Now, under the weight of scrutiny, that system was crumbling. The CEO exhaled sharply and slammed his fist against the table, sending a pen rolling onto the floor. We need damage control, and we need it now, the CEO said, his voice tense. Offer her a settlement. Make changes if necessary. Just fix this. Unbeknownst to him, a new wave of employees had already begun drafting their own complaints. Teresa's courage and the dramatic courtroom revelations had emboldened them to come forward. The firm was on the verge of a seismic shift. While negotiations were quietly starting behind the scenes, Teresa found unexpected allies rallying to her side. One of them was Melanie Cruz, a Latina woman who had interned at the marketing firm under Teresa's supervision. She emailed Rick Stanton, recounting how she had personally witnessed managers undermining Teresa's work. She was the best mentor I ever had, Melanie wrote, but they never gave her credit for her ideas. Instead, they dismissed and ridiculed her. Melanie even volunteered to testify if needed, despite the risk to her own career. Another ally emerged from within the company itself, an active manager who claimed she was fed up with the toxic culture and was willing to speak out, even if anonymously. Meanwhile, local civil rights groups organized a rally outside the courthouse. Protesters held signs reading "Equal Work, Equal Respect," while a representative from the local NAACP chapter addressed the crowd. We stand with Teresa Marshall. This is not an isolated incident. This is a reflection of systemic injustice, and it must be corrected. Inside Teresa's modest home, Rick explained the latest developments to her. The company's lawyers are hinting at a settlement, he said. They're also talking about issuing an apology, but that's probably more about public relations than sincerity. Teresa's mind raced. A part of her wanted to settle. She was exhausted, both emotionally and financially, but another part urged her to hold out for real accountability. What if we push for structural changes? She asked aloud. A mandatory diversity audit or policies to prevent this from happening again? Rick nodded thoughtfully. That's absolutely something we can negotiate. The firm is on the defensive, we have leverage. A wave of anxiety tightened in Teresa's chest. But what if they try to discredit me? Accuse me of something? Rick gave her a reassuring smile. We have the evidence. And let's not forget the White House is involved. They're not going to risk turning this into an even bigger public spectacle. She let out a slow breath. I never wanted all this attention, she admitted. But if it helps fix a broken system, maybe it's worth it. Just then, a text notification popped up on her phone. Mom, you're trending again. Hashtag Teresa's victory is going viral. It was Ava, excitedly sharing the latest social media posts praising Teresa's bravery. Some people were even calling her a modern-day Rosa Parks. The comparison felt exaggerated, but Teresa couldn't deny that something significant was shifting in the cultural landscape. Even the city's mayor had tweeted support, announcing that her administration would work with local businesses to review hiring practices. Teresa marveled at how a single person's fight could trigger a cascade of social and corporate reckoning. As the firm's internal investigation progressed, shocking revelations came to light. The manager who had overseen Teresa's division had a documented history of making racially charged comments. He had also manipulated performance reviews to disadvantage minority employees. HR records showed numerous complaints against him, complaints that had been quietly dismissed or never properly investigated. These findings spelled disaster for the company's reputation and for the manager himself. Once a powerful figure within the firm, he now found himself under intense scrutiny. With the spotlight glaring, the executives had no choice but to take swift action. Within days, he was fired. Security escorted him out of the building, just as Teresa had once been escorted out of the courtroom. The irony did not go unnoticed. Employees whispered that karma had come full circle. As the disgraced manager packed his belongings into a cardboard box, his face twisted in outrage, but the public had already made up its mind. Social media labeled him a textbook bigot, and calls for further accountability only grew louder. Even local news outlets ran segments exposing his long history of discriminatory behavior. The CEO wasn't spared from scrutiny either. Shareholders demanded explanations, and a group of major investors threatened to pull their support unless the company underwent a full leadership overhaul. The backlash forced the board to hold multiple emergency meetings. In a matter of weeks, once untouchable corporate power players found themselves on the defensive, scrambling to atone for years of veiled discrimination. This was the reckoning no one had anticipated when Teresa first filed her lawsuit. The system was finally holding people accountable, people who had long believed they were beyond consequences. Teresa sat in a sleek conference room, facing a team of corporate lawyers. Rick Stanton was beside her, and a Department of Justice liaison observed via video call. The settlement negotiations had officially begun. The company's lead attorney cleared her throat. "We're prepared to offer a substantial financial settlement, as well as full coverage of Ms. Marshall's legal fees." Rick exchanged a glance with Teresa. "And what about institutional reforms?" he asked. The attorney hesitated before responding. "We can commit to a diversity audit and revised training programs. We're also drafting a formal apology." Teresa leaned forward. "And how do we ensure this isn't just for show?" she pressed. "There need to be accountability measures, quarterly reports on hiring and promotion practices, overseen by an independent third party." The attorney's jaw tightened. "That's quite extensive." From the video screen, the DOJ liaison spoke up. "Given the severity of the evidence, external oversight seems appropriate to ensure compliance with federal standards." Tension thickened in the room. The firm's legal team huddled together, whispering and taking notes. Teresa's pulse quickened. This was the moment. This wasn't just about her, it was about the employees still working at the firm, the ones who had been too afraid to speak out before. After a brief recess, the lead attorney returned with a revised offer. It included a multi-million-dollar settlement, mandatory leadership changes, third-party oversight for at least 2 years, and a formal, public apology acknowledging that discrimination had indeed taken place. As Teresa and Rick reviewed the final draft of the agreement, she felt tears welling up. The company was offering more than she had ever imagined possible. Yet, the language of the apology still felt weak. Phrases like regrettable circumstances and unintended bias made it sound non-committal. Teresa insisted on stronger wording, pushing for a direct admission of wrongdoing. At first, the company's lawyers resisted, but with the DOJ and intense public scrutiny looming over them, they reluctantly conceded. By the end of the exhausting negotiation session, Teresa signed a historic settlement agreement, one that not only compensated her but also enforced systemic changes within the firm. As she put the final signature on paper, a wave of relief and triumph washed over her. She couldn't help but think back to that devastating moment in the courtroom when Sergeant Harrington had marched her out, and she had feared her case was lost. Now, she held in her hands a legal document that symbolized real progress toward justice. The White House's involvement, media attention, and her own unwavering determination had all led to this remarkable outcome. When news of the settlement broke, it dominated headlines. Many reports highlighted the unprecedented reforms imposed on the company. Some called it a landmark victory, while others saw it as a wake-up call. Teresa found herself flooded with interview requests. She chose to share her story selectively, speaking only with outlets that would provide meaningful discussions about systemic discrimination rather than those chasing sensational soundbites. Amid the whirlwind of attention, Teresa received an unexpected message. Sergeant Harrington wanted to meet. At first, she was hesitant, but Rick encouraged her to hear him out. After all, their encounter in the courtroom had become a symbol of power misused and a shifting tide. They met at a small cafe near the courthouse. Harrington arrived in plain clothes, looking almost hesitant. Over a cup of coffee, he spoke quietly. "I know my apology won't change what happened that day," he admitted, "but I want you to know that I've requested a transfer to the Community Relations Unit. I want to do better." Teresa studied him for a moment. "Thank you for saying that," she replied carefully. "I appreciate you reaching out. I've come to realize that this system is bigger than just one judge or one officer. We all have a role in changing it." Relief flickered across Harrington's face. They spoke for a few more minutes about the changes taking place at the courthouse: new sensitivity training, revised guidelines to prevent racial bias, and updated judicial protocols for law enforcement officers in courtrooms. As they parted ways, Teresa felt a weight lift. It wasn't forgiveness in the traditional sense, but rather an acknowledgement that people could change, that redemption was possible. She believed that real progress required bridging these gaps, even when it meant having difficult conversations. A week later, Teresa and Rick returned to the courthouse. This time, it was for the final hearing, a formality to officially enter the settlement into the record. The media presence was smaller now, but a few supporters still stood outside, holding signs that read, "Thank you, Teresa." Inside, Judge Hessington greeted her with a reserved nod. The judge appeared more guarded in light of the controversy, yet there was also something else in her expression, a glimmer of respect. This wasn't the same woman Hessington had dismissed weeks ago. Teresa was now someone recognized nationwide for taking a stand against injustice. The hearing was brief. "The parties have reached a settlement?" Judge Hessington asked. The defense attorney responded, "Yes, Your Honor." Rick added, "We are satisfied with the terms, Your Honor." The judge's gaze shifted to Teresa. "Ms. Marshall, do you believe this settlement adequately addresses your concerns?" Teresa took a steady breath, memories rushing back. The humiliation of being removed from the courtroom, the overwhelming frustration, the unexpected hope, the call from the White House. "Yes, Your Honor," she said firmly. "I believe this is a step toward real justice." A quiet murmur passed through the courtroom. Judge Hessington gave a solemn nod. "Then it is so ordered." She struck the gavel once. And just like that, the case that had consumed Teresa's life came to a close. Outside, reporters swarmed her with questions, but she kept her response simple. "I'm grateful that the truth finally came to light, and I hope this inspires others to speak up. This victory isn't just for me. It's for everyone fighting against discrimination." Her words carried through the crisp air as she walked down the courthouse steps, feeling lighter than she had in months. This was more than just a personal victory. It was proof of the power of perseverance, the importance of allies, and the unpredictable ways in which justice could unfold. In the weeks that followed, Teresa's life gradually returned to normal, though she knew she would never be the same. She received countless messages from people who had been inspired by her courage. Most importantly, she made sure to spend more time with Ava, wanting her daughter to understand the significance of everything that had happened. The marketing firm began implementing the reforms outlined in the settlement. Early reports indicated greater transparency in hiring and promotions. An independent watchdog had been appointed to ensure compliance, and employees felt a renewed sense of optimism about their workplace. As for Teresa, she decided to channel her experience into something meaningful. With Rick's help, she established a small consultancy dedicated to helping companies create genuinely inclusive environments. She began offering training workshops and auditing services. Former classmates, colleagues, and even employees from her old firm reached out for advice. One rainy afternoon, as she sat at her kitchen table reviewing documents, a letter arrived, a formal correspondence from the Department of Justice. Inside, she found an official commendation for her role in exposing systemic discrimination. A high-ranking official had signed it, thanking her for making workplaces across the nation fairer and more just. Tears filled Teresa's eyes as she read it. This recognition felt surreal. She thought back to the fear she had felt in that courthouse hallway, the sting of humiliation as she was led away in front of an audience. Now, it all seemed like part of a larger story, a journey that proved even the most entrenched systems could be challenged. Outside, the rain clouds parted, allowing a beam of sunlight to break through. A rainbow stretched across the sky, arching over the neighborhood. Teresa smiled, interpreting it as a symbol of hope. She carefully placed the letter on top of the settlement papers, a reminder of how far she had come. And so ends the extraordinary story of a single voice, once silenced, then amplified by the highest levels of power, achieving justice not only for herself but for countless others who might otherwise have remained voiceless. Thank you for accompanying us on this incredible journey. Teresa Marshall's fight began as an individual discrimination case, buried in a crowded courthouse, but it quickly erupted into a national story that shook corporate worlds and even reached the White House. From her forced removal by a skeptical police officer to the pivotal intervention from Washington, Teresa's resilience and moral courage reshaped her life and impacted the lives of many others. She showed us that when you stand strong in the truth, the ripples can create monumental change. If this story moved you or changed the way you view justice, let us know by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Your support helps more people discover stories like Teresa's and sparks real-world change. So, hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and share this video with your friends. Together, we can build a more equitable future for all.